Hi, I'm Gill Townend, and I'm delighted to be speaking to you about communication research, and especially the Rett Syndrome Communication Guidelines, a project that has been and continues to be very close to my heart. Now, we've already had some great speakers, and we have more to come. And one thing that I think is apparent from everything that has been said is how everything is so closely connected in Rett syndrome. Every symptom, every feature has an impact on all aspects of life. For the child or adult with Rett syndrome, their family, caregivers, and the professionals who work with them, the therapists, doctors, and teachers. And that is just the same with communication. Communication is so vitally important for every aspect of life, for the relationships we build with people around us, for expression of wants and needs, feelings, opinions, self-determination, and life choices. And that is why a team came together in 2016 with funding from rettsyndrome.org, now the International Rett Syndrome Foundation, in a project to develop the Rett Syndrome Communication Guidelines, an international set of guidelines for the assessment, intervention, and long-term management of communication that parents and caregivers and the whole team around someone with Rett syndrome could learn from and use to provide a basic standard of care and provision, regardless of where in the world they are. This project took a threefold approach, reviewing the research and published literature around communication and Rett syndrome, conducting surveys of parents and speech and language therapists to ask about their experiences, needs and priorities, and working with an expert panel to produce the final set of guidelines. In total, 650 people from 43 countries contributed to the project in 16 languages. And the first set of English language guidelines were published in 2020. Here you can see the 8 sections that the guidelines fall into: guiding principles, professional practice, features of Rett syndrome and coexisting conditions, strategies to optimise engagement, assessment, AAC assessment, assessment of AAC system and device, and intervention. So let's take a very brief look at what some of these sections include. I've already mentioned that everything is interconnected in Rett syndrome, and here you can see a figure that highlights how all of the things that you're hearing about in this conference impact communication. For example, altered muscle tone and movement difficulties, breathing and respiratory problems, impaired sleep, gastrointestinal issues. This figure is taken from section 3 of the guidelines, and there we talk about each of these things and how they can affect communication. And that's something that it's important for everyone to know. In the following section, section 4, we talk about some of the things you can do to help alleviate the impact of these features on communication. And we also talk about important things that communication partners can do to support communication in any situation. And by communication partners, we really mean anyone who interacts with, communicates with someone with Rett syndrome. Here are some examples. Communication partners should have an open mind to the communication potential of the individual with Rett syndrome, be responsive in their interactions, acknowledging and reinforcing all communication attempts, be consistent in approach, language and vocabulary, adapt to natural situations and activities so that opportunities for communication are created, keep communication in the here and now, follow the individual's lead, make the individual's AAC system or device available at all times, give feedback and attribute meaning, use multimodal communication, model vocabulary as they talk to an individual throughout the day, make sure that vocabulary, topics and activities are appropriate to the interests of the individual, and be aware of delayed response time. And if you would like to know more about some very current research in the area of responsive communication partner strategies, then I would recommend you look at these two recent publications from our very own Helena Wandin, whose talk follows on from mine. In Section 5, we explore assessment, especially assessment of language and cognition. And one of the messages the guidelines strive to get across is that all people with Rett syndrome are not of low intellectual or cognitive ability. It's simply that we have not been assessing them in the right way previously. People with Rett syndrome have intelligence and can learn, but need a way to be able to show that. And the key way is through tapping into their use of eye gaze and eye gaze technology, both for assessment and for communication. Here are some examples of the statements and recommendations the guidelines make. Assessment should not take place at a single moment in time. It should be ongoing and dynamic. Assessment should be part of a team process. Standardised assessments may not accurately reflect an individual's underlying ability, nor their communicative and learning potential. Yet standardised assessments may be adapted to obtain information on certain specific skills. And these adapted assessments can be used to assess expressive language, receptive vocabulary, and cognition. Adaptations may include modifying presentation of test materials, for example, mounting items on a board, using partner-assisted scanning, eye gaze, or other AAC strategies as response modalities. Assessments should include identification of the most appropriate access method for an individual, for example, their eyes or their hands. And largely, eye gaze is the best access method for assessment of cognition and assessment of receptive and expressive language skills. And once again, if you'd like to know more about recent research which demonstrates the value of adapting assessments, here are some publications I'd recommend. One of which was a study that I undertook with two colleagues in the UK, Callie Ward and Shula Chiat, to assess language and cognition, based on two earlier studies in America and Israel. And then a slightly different type of assessment tool developed by Helena to assess visual attention. And in the final section of the guidelines, we explore intervention, a huge topic, with recommendations in many areas. Here are just a few examples. Communication should be developed across multiple modalities. An individual should have more than one AAC system or device for use in different situations and settings. A low-tech system should always be available as a backup for a high-tech system. Language intervention should begin with exposure to a robust vocabulary so that potential for communication is unlimited, and that robust vocabulary can be used in conjunction with a smaller set of choices that are appropriate for specific situations. Vocabulary in an AAC system should allow for change and flexibility. Developing a yes-no response is important for all individuals with Rett syndrome, and partner-assisted scanning can be used once a yes-no response has been established. Aided AAC can be introduced and used successfully in adulthood, and aided AAC can also be used by individuals who are ambulatory. And then communication intervention and management should start early and be lifelong. Goals to expand the range of communication functions should be included, and communication intervention will help the individual to become more autonomous as a communicator. Again, a couple of recent articles for further reading, reviews that provide interesting summaries of interventions for people with Rett syndrome, including communication interventions. And here, some recent articles focusing on the value of eye gaze technology for developing cognitive skills, communication, and independence for people with Rett syndrome. So, having given you a very brief overview of the guidelines, How can you access them and share the information? What languages are the guidelines now available in? We have several options for sharing information. We have infographics available in different languages, the handbook in both the full and reduced formats available in multiple languages, and a series of webinars. Here are links to some webinars that myself and another member of the project team, Teresa Bartolotta, have given in English for the IRSF. And here are the languages that the guidelines have been translated into. First, American English, British English, Brazilian Portuguese, Spanish, Swedish, Russian, Polish, a shortened version available in German, and soon to be published Dutch, Turkish, French, and Chinese. Finally, here are the references for the guidelines and an article we wrote about their development. And if you are interested in working with me on a translation into your own language, then please do get in touch. I'd be pleased to discuss that with you. Thank you very much for listening.